Morning, everybody.
Morning.
The reality of the moment being what it is, I came to my home temple today to help out. So a Dharma talk behind me just ended. There's a kids program in the other rooms around me. There's coffee and cookies happening just outside this door. So I did my best to set myself up so that the audio's decent. Let me know if it's not. Um,
It's fine.
It's good.
okay. Fine. Like less than good.
It's good.
It's good. Okay, great. I use the voice isolation thing, so it zeroes in on me at the expense of other things. Um, so I'm as I said, I'm at Clouds and Water Zen Center, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota, on the unceded stolen land of the ancestral and contemporary home of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people.
Mm.
Um, and I wanted to talk today about the Bodhisattva Vow, um, and how to begin talking about that. As you might imagine, things are such that I didn't get to think too much about what I wanted to talk about, but I got to feel into what I wanted to talk about. Yeah. So, as some of you might know, I'm also going to be teaching at the Cedar Rapids Zen Center pretty often this year, in Iowa. And they did this interesting thing when they first brought me on to create like a Sangha survey because I'm the first kind of consistent teacher that they're having since their founder, Zuiko Redding, died, I believe, last year. And so they made a survey and they sent the survey out to the Sangha. And, I had kind of general questions like, what do you think a teacher's role should be? What do you hope they focus on? What vibe do you want them to create? And then they collected the responses and they sent them back to me, and they sent them back to me in two batches. One was like, here's what the Sangha said. And it's all collated. And then they're like, and then there was one person that we don't know that took the opportunity to just really go to town on you and us and American Zen, and the kind of usual thing. When you're in the business, you see it a lot. It's never surprising. It's never inventive. Um, you can kind of know what they're going to say before they say it. And I don't bring it up to tell you like somebody was mean to me and I want to vent about it, but I bring you up because I think it's an interesting teaching point, interesting thing to consider. One of the questions was something like, what do you hope the teacher talks about? You know? And the response was, enlightenment is all that matters, and it makes talks unnecessary, or something like that. And I'm just like, this is somebody that learned Buddhism from books, and that happens a lot in this country. You learn Buddhism from books. So you have this thing that's kind of like exists in a vacuum. You're not engaging with the lived tradition and the way it manifests in actual communities. And so it becomes a type of philosophy. Um, and it's kind of a sitting duck for so many of our imputations, because as we've seen uh, in very recent history, but all throughout human history, two people can be looking at the same thing and draw very different conclusions, you know. Um, and so the precondition of the mind is, and if you were at the class last week, uh, 8 days ago. Gosh, seems like ages ago. The storehouse consciousness is where all of your kind of preconditions kind of exist to be activated when you encounter something in front of you. So when we're encountering something in front of us, we think that we're getting a direct message from the thing in front of us, but what we're getting is an interaction between all of our conditioning and it's that's being elicited, a response that's being elicited by the thing in front of us, that's always considering it in reference to our own safety. It's always considering things in terms of safety and opportunity. What does this thing mean to me? And your cross reference, well, what do we know about this? What do we know about this shape and form? Let's check the database. Is this good news or is this bad news? What does it mean to me? And that's how I decide how I respond. And it happens in an instant. So without knowing it, we can read a book on Buddhism and have an idea about what it means. That is informed by all of the preconditions that we have, and we think it's clear as day, but it's not as clear as day, you know, unless we're trying to be curious about all the different things it could mean, you know. So, but this, on one hand, I read through it and I read it out loud to, my roommates and stuff. And I'm like, listen to this. It's like someone, asked Chat GPT to give an angry rant about about American Zen or something like that. But I got called too political, I got called woke. Um, and that's interesting since Buddha means woke. Um, and um, and on one hand, it's funny. On one hand, it's predictable. And it's like, oh boy, we got a live one here, whatever. But on the other hand, coming from my vocation, it's frustrating and it's sad, to and it's an extreme version of something that is actually very, very common. And in all of us have a certain degree of I think, I don't know, at least speaking for myself, this person that's kind of lobbing this stuff at me is not so remote from views that I've held. I think some of us get into this kind of being like, well, life shouldn't feel this way, and I need to be fortified by something transcendent. So we hear this word enlightenment, and we're like, okay, enlightenment is this realm where everything that bums me out doesn't exist, or every limitation that I have, I no longer have, or something like that. And the reality that I live in doesn't upset me, you know. And in Buddhist teaching, there's sometimes when we're talking about mind states, mental states, there's what we call the wholesome mind states. And so a lot of the wholesome mind states have what we call their near enemies. The near enemy of a wholesome mind state is something that looks like it, but ain't quite it, you know. So the near enemy of equanimity is aloofness. And I spent the good first 4 years of my practice at the monastery trying to cultivate aloofness, and understanding the teachings on liberation as an injunction to really develop my ability to not give a shit, you know, which is a much easier and much lower threshold than actually becoming a bodhisattva, a liberated and liberating being, you know. So when we look at this idea, bodhisattva, or we look at this idea of the Mahayana, this dichotomy developed in the first century of the Common Era of the great vehicle versus the small vehicle. And sometimes people interpret this as, kind of two schools talking smack on each other. You have like, it's like Raiders versus Niners or something like that, but it ain't quite that. How do we understand this in a way that gives us a practical thing to consider for our own engagement with the teachings? So Mahayana, large vehicle fits more people. Large vehicle fits everybody. Hinayana, small vehicle, it's a single occupancy, kayak. That's the Hinayana, the small vehicle. It's not the name for an actual school of Buddhism. There's nobody that's like, we are the Hinayana school, And it's not really the name for the Theravadan school of Buddhism, which is sometimes people say, well, we don't say Hinayana anymore, we say Theravada. But those are not synonyms, but it's a type of description that was employed during the certain era of Buddhism to say, to call out and point out that there's an approach to practice that is the single occupancy kayak, and kind of saying like, that is useless. That is not good for you. That's not good for your family. That's not good for your neighbor. And so we so there's this idea of the big raft, the great vehicle for crossing over to the other shore, the vehicle that fits all beings. And our job is to not get ourselves onto our single kayak and cross the shore, but our jobs is to become facilitators for populating this great raft that's going off to the other shore with all of us together. you know? So the idea here is, one of us can't be liberated until all of us are liberated. And this is the Bodhisattva vow. Now, that sounds great. What does that mean? Are we talking about something metaphysical? Are we talking about something hypothetical? Are we talking about an attitude? Or are we talking about something concrete and practical? Does the way a bodhisattva helps, does it look like spiritual support, or does it look like actual concrete support in all the conventional ways? So when we look at that, what's the difference between the conventional and the absolute? Where does the absolute exist? Is there an absolute that we go to? Like this person that wrote this letter, enlightenment is all that exists. Or enlightenment is all that matters. And talking doesn't matter once you're enlightened or something like that. That's a very interesting take. Where is that enlightenment supposed to exist so that talking doesn't matter? Where do you go? What kind of vacuum do you enter into when you're liberated? Where does the absolute, where's that realm? And if you really actually study this stuff deeply, and we study the what Dogen Zenji called Zenki, total dynamic functioning, or if we study Nagarjuna, and we look at this idea of the two truths, the relative and the absolute, there is no absolute that exists outside of its manifest aspect. What's its manifest aspect? What we call the relative truth. It's kind of like electricity. How do you experience electricity? You experience electricity through the ways that it manifests. If you're shocked by it, it's an engagement between your tactile sensation, which is a concrete material thing, which is the relative world. If we're watching the screen right now, we're watching the manifest aspect of electricity itself. If you take the screen away, the relative nuts and bolts, the parts, I know there's no nuts and bolts really in computers, but like if you take away the medium, if you take away the medium of experiencing the absolute will not be experienced. So what we call the relative is the texture of this absolute. And the job is to see the texture as a manifestation of the absolute. Not an opt-out, but to see the dynamic functioning of karma and emptiness arising in each moment. Emptiness is not the opposite of karma. The absolute is not the opposite of the relative. It's not an opt-out. It's like Dogen Zenji says in the Genjo Koan. He goes through all this thing about the interplay of the relative and the absolute. And then he says, yet in attachment, blossoms fall, and in aversion, weeds spread. Just bringing it down to the basics. It's like, we could say all this stuff about the relative and the absolute, but, when you're sad, and when you're happy, you're happy. Love is love and hate is hate. So, how do we manifest the Bodhisattva vow in our daily lives? It's not some kind of hypothetical thing. It's not, compassion is not a sentiment. Being a bodhisattva is not an attitude. It starts with an attitude, but it's not just like an interesting way to view your life so that your practice is benefited. That's still Hinayana. That's still the single occupancy kayak. When you view compassion and the Bodhisattva vow as something kind of like a worldview for yourself, as a means for being more liberated. It's not hypothetical. Dogen Zenji said, the way is actualized by rolling up the sleeves. We're engaging this vow in concrete ways in our lives, with our families, with our communities, with each other. The Bodhisattva vow is manifested by feeding one that needs food, by protecting one that needs protecting. And it involves a constant confrontation with the part of us that really wants that single occupancy kayak. That's why it's considered a more difficult practice than a small vehicle. In the Daishin Dharani, so we just chanted the English translation of Daishin Dharani, great compassionate Dharani. There's a line of brave as a lion. Brave as a lion for what? To come head on to that part of me that just really wishes I didn't have to. So what's our practice for? Is it just running yourself ragged, just trying to help everybody? Well, then what's the good news? In the Tibetan tradition, the word for Buddhist, and if we translate it into English, it means something like interior being or inner being. Which sounds almost like if we take it with our preloaded conceptuality of individualism, of our Euro-American individualism, we hear interior being. We're like, yeah, I'm withdrawn. I'm not concerning myself with all the rat race and politics and things outside of me that are a headache. I'm an interior being. But I would argue against that view. I would say that an interior being is one that is fortified from within by their practice. And this is something that you can see across religions and faith traditions. When I go to the meetings, because right now we're very, very active here in the Twin Cities, and this resistance is largely clergy are playing a big role in this resistance. And the Christians that are very upset that their faith tradition has been hijacked by white nationalism and misinterpreted and contaminated. And when I'm with the Muslim clergy, when I'm with the Christian clergy, when I'm with the rabbis, there's this sense of what we all have in common of being fortified from within by our relationship to the divine or the absolute. So to let that be what interior being means for us. Not someone that's self-absorbed or self-obsessed. Not someone that's like, how am I going to free myself from these things? Dalai Lama says, if you want others to be happy, serve them. And if you want yourself to be happy, serve them. There's this way that engaging in our communities and engaging with our neighbors and engaging with our families that actually takes the spotlight off of my issues so that I actually, my Zen teacher, he started, he had some memory, as he aged, he started losing his memory and stuff. And he smoked for a lot of his adult life. And then he just forgot that he smoked. We think of it as this chemical thing that your body has a craving from it, but he forgot that he smoked. Or he felt dis-ease and he didn't have that connection that the way I respond to this dis-ease is to smoke again. And in our practice, sometimes we talk about Zen in terms of letting go of past and future and existing, being right here now in this moment. So that what? Well, when I used to work in restaurants, we'd, if it was before the lunch rush, we'd be kind of like, we'd be leaning against the counter, kind of bullshit and looking at our phones and stuff like that. And then you hear that little ticket print and you know that it's time to make something. And in that environment, when the ticket prints, you're like, oh, here we go, But when you're in the middle of a rush and you're in the weeds, as we call it, ticket after ticket, meal after meal that you're making, it doesn't occur to you to feel put out because there is no comparison, What's the point of that? How did I start on that? Oh, existing as a helping being, existing as a serving being, existing as a being that takes it personal, makes it personal, that I am the same as others, and I am brave as a lion to, relinquish this self-clinging a bit, relinquish this self-connection a bit, but also taking the steps to fortify myself to be able to be brave as a lion, to be that inner being that is nourished from within so that I can engage in my community bravely and do what needs to be done and not make my spirituality be some kind of obsession with myself. You know, we care about ourselves to the extent that we're fortifying ourselves to be okay enough to meet this world of suffering and be an agent within it of transformation for self and others, to usher everybody onto the boat. And we can't even begin to talk about enlightenment until the four requisites are met. What are the four requisites? Housing, food, clothing, medicine. It's right there in early Buddhism. Buddhism wasn't saying enlightenment is more important than housing, food, clothing, and medicine. You know? So if we want to get everybody on the big raft, we want everybody to practice the Bodhisattva path, we need housing, food, clothing, and medicine. It's not political as opposed to spiritual. There's no realm where liberation is going to happen without taking care of each other. So this Bodhisattva path, it's not hypothetical. It's not an attitude, although it includes an attitude. You know, it's not merely a sentiment, but it's rolling up the sleeves. It's a practice and it's a labor. And the sneaky thing here is that it's joyous. It's joyous to become a part of this community. We've been very well trained. I can't tell you. If I want food and I know that there's a place that has the most perfect thing that I love, you know, where's the ramen place I went to next to the pool store and the Panda Express on that big street in Omaha. There's a ramen shop. I think it starts with a J. Anyway, Jinya. Anyway, so they have Tantan Men, which is a very good noodle dish that has ground sesame seeds in it and chili oil. It's very nice. If I have a craving for that and I know that I want that, and I go online to order it for pickup, and the online ordering system is down, and it says, "Oh, Toast Tab is down. Please call," or something like that. I won't call. I'll look for the second best place because I don't want to talk to anybody. You know, some of us are like that. And I think it's a growing issue. You know, I think more of us, when my friends call me for a voice call, I'm like, what the hell are you doing? What is there an emergency? You know, but something shows up and we're seeing it in Minneapolis. Communities are communicating with each other and organizing meetings, organizing mutual aid, organizing food delivery, grocery delivery for people that are afraid to leave their houses because they think they're going to get kidnapped. Sometimes within 3 hours of you getting picked up, you're on a plane to Nebraska, to Texas, to one of these detention facilities. You know, and when they started the initial um, kind of cohort of organizing around mutual aid. There were 2,000 families on it. Now there's 25,000 families on it. Something like that. And what does that do for you? Is it, early it's like, well, actually what I'd really like to do is watch Columbo because I'm stressed out about all this news. That's Hinayana. That is not our vows. That is not what we've committed to do. The Bodhisattva path is not watching Columbo and feeling sorry for people that are having a hard time. Compassion is not a sentiment. It's rolling up the sleeves, figuring out what we're resourced to do. I'm not trying to break anyone's neck here. Figuring out what you're resourced to do, what your capacity is. I don't want anyone to lose their job. I don't want anyone to get, put themselves in danger too much. But to confront that self-clinging, to confront that bubble that American life has so primed us to be to think that we're satisfied with, but we know we're not satisfied with it. you know? And then what happens when you go to the meeting of the mutual aid or something like that, you meet your neighbors and you get to eat their macaroni and cheese that they brought with paper plates, you know? And it's it's amazing how the crisis that we're in right now can turn up the heat to an extent where we start to relate to each other in ways that are long overdue, I think, you know. Now, practically, how to be an inner being, how to fortify yourself to feel to be brave as a lion, you know. Well, when we're sitting zazen, if we've read some of the early Buddhist texts, or depending on what our engagement with the teachings are, it can seem like the purpose of this practice is to be able to identify our delusion and get rid of it. You know, to be able to identify our limitations so that we can work on ourselves, you know, kind of this laborious yogic engagement. But I would want to suggest that there's another way to practice, you know, that isn't a laborious engagement of self-improvement, but it's to receive the gift of the felt experience of your aliveness, of your awareness itself, you know. So what would it be like if we sat zazen and forgot about meditating and just like drank from this river of the sustaining life force? You know? And I think if you have that in mind and you engage some of the traditional teachings, if you engage Dogen Zenji, if you engage some of the Chan masters, you might start to see that in there once you get curious if that's a suitable approach rather than self-improvement. You know, it's the cornerstone of the Pure Land school where their main practice is like, thank God we're enlightened. You know, Namu Amida Butsu. Namu Amida Butsu, the chant of the Pure Land sect, is in a way saying, thank God we're enlightened. You know, and if you say, thank God I'm enlightened, it fortifies you with that resilience. You know, sometimes, you know, there's a movement, there's a thing that started here kind of recently. I think recently, I met the person that kind of started it at a preliminary training called movement chaplaincy. And has anyone ever heard of movement chaplaincy? It's it's like so let's say there's a protest, let's say there's a demonstration, let's say there's authorities and citizens on both sides of each other, and the clergy are there to ground and care for everybody present, you know, including the authorities, including the federal agents, and be like, how are you feeling right now with all these people yelling at you? You know, and sometimes they engage, sometimes they don't. You know, but we're not there to police any behaviors. We're not there to teach anyone how to protest the right way, but we're there to care for people. You know, and caring for people, let me see, movement chaplaincy. Now, if you go with the idea that I'm me, I'm this limited self, and I'm just going to go there as a limited, vulnerable being, you know, or you can go, I'm going to bear witness. I'm going to bear witness and be like a heavenly messenger of the liberating freedom of my tradition. You know, that's what we had there's a demonstration a couple days ago at the airport where about 100 clergy got arrested. And at the training for that, where they were preparing people for that demonstration, they said, you're not getting arrested, you're bearing witness, you know? And how much does that attitude fortify one to be brave as a lion, you know, going into that? Like, this isn't about me, you know? And there are plenty of people where it's like, getting arrested is not in the cards for me, you know? My daughter lives in Canada. I won't be able to visit my daughter if I get arrested, you know, or I have a record or whatever. That's great. But we find other ways, you know, but you just start to begin to get curious about engendering that spirit of being with our neighbors because we're, I think, in the early phases of a very difficult time.
Mm.
What's happening in Minnesota is testing ground for the efficacy of lawless authoritarianism across the country. And what's trying to be incited here is trying to be incited for the sake of postponing elections so that there can be martial law. So, uh, and I don't know if it's necessary to say this, but if you're disappointed that I'm talking about politics, I want to say that is the language of our communal human existence in terms of the ways that it's organized. There is no absolute outside of the texture of the relative. We don't get to opt out of this engagement, you know? Um, and if you do, let's say you do, let's say you do, let's say you opt out of this engagement. Let's say, you're demographically safe and you can just stay home. From a Buddhist point of view, that's not generating liberative karma. That's not creating the mind stream that is capable of liberation. That is not participating in the ushering of all sentient beings to the other shore. So from the point of view of the Mahayana tradition of the Bodhisattva perspective, it is not practicing the Bodhisattva way, to hide in this moment. So a monk asked Yunmen, you know, what is the teaching of the Tathagata? And Yunmen said, an appropriate response. Some people translate it as an appropriate statement, but I think we're beyond statements. I think, we manifest the Buddha way by rolling up the sleeves. So I feel satisfied and complete, but I'm happy to hear your questions if you have any. Thank you very much.